I want you to picture a quiet kitchen at night, bills spread across the table while I explain how security promises quietly transform ordinary paychecks into permanent obligations without asking permission. I'm not talking about flags or speeches, but about the moment when protection stops feeling abstract and starts showing up as smaller paychecks, higher prices, and long-term debt. For decades, I was told this system guaranteed stability, shared responsibility, and peace, yet when I follow the money, I see a machine that consumes wealth faster than fear can justify. This story is not about soldiers or strategy, but about accounting interest and the silent arithmetic that converts geopolitical decisions into lifelong financial commitments for regular households. When governments promise safety, I have learned to ask who pays first, who pays later, and who keeps collecting long after the original danger has faded from memory. I realised the true cost only when defence budgets began growing faster than schools, hospitals, and infrastructure, while leaders assured us the sacrifice was temporary and necessary. What rarely gets explained is how quickly temporary measures become permanent fixtures quietly embedded into budgets that never seem to shrink again. Once spending locks in entire industries reorganize around it, incentives shift and reversing course becomes politically impossible without risking careers and campaign funding. I want to walk you through this system calmly, not to scare you, but to show how massive financial decisions hide behind comforting language about unity and protection. If you feel confused or frustrated by rising costs and shrinking public services, this is where those pressures quietly begin. The first illusion is shared burden, because while everyone contributes something, the scale of contribution is wildly uneven and grows heavier with every new commitment. What starts as cooperation slowly becomes dependency, as smaller economies align their priorities with larger ones simply to remain compliant. Over time, national budgets stop reflecting local needs and instead mirror alliance requirements written far away from the people funding them. I'm asking you to step back and view security the way an accountant would, not as an emotion, but as a recurring expense with compounding consequences. When protection becomes a subscription missing, a payment is framed as reckless, even if paying means cutting deeply into social foundations. This framing keeps the conversation emotional because fear is easier to sell than spreadsheets and far more effective at silencing uncomfortable questions. I am not here to argue morality, but to expose mechanics, because systems can function exactly as designed while still producing devastating outcomes. Once you understand those mechanics, headlines read differently, and promises of safety start sounding like long-term invoices. From this point forward, every example I share connects directly back to household finances, even when the language sounds global and strategic. By the end, my goal is simple: to make the cost visible so you can decide whether the trade being made in your name is truly worth it. The moment this system hardened was when a simple percentage quietly became a command, turning national budgets into automatic transfers rather than flexible tools for domestic priorities. That percentage sounded harmless, yet tying security spending to economic output guaranteed that growth would never ease pressure, only expand the absolute cost every single year. Once the rule existed, politicians stopped debating necessity and instead argued about compliance, shifting the conversation away from outcomes and toward obedience. Countries that once invested cautiously were suddenly forced to accelerate spending regardless of whether their real security environment had changed at all. This created a synchronized buying frenzy where many governments chased the same equipment at the same time, guaranteeing higher prices before the first contract was signed. Defense suppliers quickly realized demand was political rather than practical, meaning cost control mattered far less than speed and alignment. As orders piled up, production bottlenecks appeared, and every delay justified another price increase framed as unavoidable complexity. What looks like modernization on paper often delivers less capability in reality because inflation erodes purchasing power faster than budgets can rise. When spending grows this fast, it rarely comes from surplus but from borrowing that quietly shifts the burden onto future taxpayers. Debt makes these commitments sticky because reversing course would expose financial weakness that markets punish without mercy. Smaller economies feel this pressure first, since even modest increases can distort public finances and crowd out social investment. The promise of shared defense masks a reality where risk is pooled, but interest payments remain stubbornly national. Every new procurement decision carries decades of maintenance costs that rarely appear in the original announcement. These life cycle obligations transform equipment into long-term financial anchors, dragging budgets year after year. Even when threats cool, contracts remain active, technicians stay employed, and payments continue on schedule. Over time, governments begin budgeting around weapons rather than citizens because breaking contracts is harder than cutting services. This is how security slowly rewrites fiscal priorities without ever passing a direct vote on trade-offs. By the time voters notice, the spending structure is already locked in by law, debt, and alliance expectations. What was sold as a minimum standard becomes a baseline that only moves in one direction. From here on, every expansion multiplies cost automatically long before anyone assesses whether it actually improves safety. After the money is committed, the next shock arrives quietly through logistics, where moving equipment often costs more than buying it, yet almost no one discusses this before agreements are signed. Weapons are designed for battle, but budgets are broken by roads, bridges, ports and rail systems never built to carry such extraordinary weight. Much of Europe modernized for the civilian life, not for heavy convoys, creating a mismatch that now demands enormous retrofitting under the banner of preparedness. Reinforcing infrastructure sounds harmless until you realize it redirects billions toward projects that serve military movement rather than daily public use. Every strengthened bridge quietly becomes a dual-use tax paid by civilians, while optimized for scenarios they may never support. Rail systems reveal the problem clearly as incompatible standards force costly transfers, delays, and duplication that compound expenses at every border crossing. Bureaucracy adds another layer because moving dangerous equipment legally requires paperwork that multiplies costs even before engines start. To speed movement, governments attempt legal shortcuts, hiring consultants and lawyers whose fees quietly rival physical construction costs. The result is a logistics economy where efficiency is promised but overruns are guaranteed. These investments are justified as resilience, yet they rarely improve daily transport, leaving commuters wondering why congestion never improves. As alliance borders expand, the map of required infrastructure stretches outward into regions previously left untouched. Remote forests, coastlines and Arctic terrain suddenly require roads, airfields and depots capable of handling foreign forces. Each kilometre added multiplies maintenance costs permanently regardless of whether troops ever arrive. Standardization deepens the expense, forcing nations to abandon cheaper local solutions in favour of approved systems. Interoperability sounds cooperative, but financially it functions like vendor lock-in. Once standards are adopted, replacement parts, software updates and training must come from the same suppliers indefinitely. This locks national infrastructure into long-term dependency chains that resist political change. Citizens see construction everywhere yet feel no improvement because the benefits flow upward into strategic readiness rather than outward into daily life. Over time, logistics spending normalizes, becoming invisible even as it rivals core social investment. What appears as mobility on a map ultimately translates into higher taxes and thinner public services at home. After logistics comes escalation, where each attempt to feel safer convinces someone else they are less safe, triggering a cycle that feeds itself through constant budget expansion. In economic terms, this is the security dilemma, a feedback loop where defensive moves are interpreted as threats and answered with even greater spending. What makes this dynamic dangerous is that it has no natural stopping point once borders and commitments keep growing outward. Each new member increases the perimeter that must be monitored, defended, and reassured at all times. Longer borders demand more surveillance, more air defense, and more permanent forces stationed far from home. These forces require advanced technology that grows exponentially more expensive as threats become more complex. Modern defense no longer scales linearly because stopping a cheap attack often requires extraordinarily costly countermeasures. This imbalance turns security into a losing exchange rate where protection costs far more than provocation. As perceived risk rises, insurance investment and borrowing costs rise alongside it, quietly taxing entire regions. Businesses factor instability into decisions, slowing growth and reinforcing the very economic weakness that justifies more spending. Governments respond by promising deterrence, yet deterrence itself requires continuous visible investment to remain credible. That visibility becomes a performance designed to signal strength even when the financial strain is growing severe. Over time, threat inflation sets in because maintaining urgency is easier than explaining restraint. Each budget cycle assumes higher danger than the last, regardless of whether conditions actually changed. This permanently elevated threat environment locks nations into high alert spending modes. The cost is not only financial but psychological, shaping policy through fear rather than measured assessment. Citizens adapt to this tension, normalizing extraordinary spending as the price of stability. Meanwhile, debt quietly accumulates beneath the rhetoric, compounding the future cost of present anxiety. Escalation does not require conflict to be expensive, only anticipation. At this stage, security becomes a perpetual subscription whose price rises precisely because everyone believes cancellation is impossible. Once escalation normalizes, attention shifts quietly toward who benefits most because every expanding system creates winners long before it delivers safety. The modern defense economy rewards scale, not restraint, concentrating wealth among a handful of firms positioned closest to political decision-making. Each new commitment triggers long-term contracts that guarantee revenue regardless of whether equipment is ever used. Governments present these deals as necessities, yet they function like public subsidies insulated from normal market risk. When demand is enforced by policy, competition weakens and prices drift upward without meaningful resistance. This environment transforms defense suppliers into quasi-utilities paid first and questioned last. Expansion multiplies customers, instantly turning entire nations into captive markets. Procurement decisions become less about fit and more about alignment with alliance expectations. Once locked in switching suppliers, it becomes prohibitively expensive even if better options exist. Maintenance and software obligations quietly eclipse the original purchase price over time. These recurring costs create predictable cash flows that investors prize above all else. Political leaders praise partnership while corporate earnings reports tell the real story. The revolving door tightens as officials rotate seamlessly between public office and private boards. This circulation blurs accountability, aligning career incentives with continued expansion. Public debate narrows because questioning procurement can be framed as undermining security. Over time, skepticism becomes political risk while approval becomes the safest personal strategy. The result is a corporate welfare structure funded by taxpayers, but defended as national necessity. Wealth accumulates upward while fiscal pressure spreads outward across society. Citizens fund systems they do not control and outcomes they cannot audit. At this point, security policy resembles an investment portfolio optimized for profit rather than protection. Beyond money and hardware lies a quieter cost, the distortion of talent, where the brightest minds are pulled toward defense because that is where funding feels safest. When enormous budgets concentrate in one sector, they act like gravity-bending career paths away from civilian innovation. Young engineers quickly learn that stability and pay favor military projects over public infrastructure or medical research. This choice is rarely ideological because student loans and living costs make idealism expensive. As a result, entire generations optimize for security work rather than solving civilian problems. Research priorities slowly realign because grants follow money and money follows perceived threats. Promising technologies are redirected towards surveillance, targeting, and automation instead of sustainability or health. Even breakthroughs advertised as neutral often arrive pre-shaped for defense applications. Innovation narrows as risk-taking outside approved priorities becomes harder to finance. Civilian sectors fall behind not because talent disappears, but because incentives quietly change. This creates a long-term productivity gap that no single budget vote can easily reverse. While military research accelerates, public technology stagnates beneath outdated systems. The imbalance compounds over time, weakening the economic base that defense spending depends upon. Competitors investing in infrastructure and energy gain advantages that weapons alone cannot offset. The opportunity cost becomes invisible, measured in what was never built. Societies celebrate technical brilliance while directing it toward destructive efficiency. Education systems adjust curricula to match demand, reinforcing the cycle further. Students graduate into a market where the safest path leads away from public benefit. Over decades, this reshapes national capabilities more deeply than any single weapon system. The true loss is not money, but time and human potential that cannot be reclaimed. As financial pressure mounts, smaller nations discover that security commitments quietly limit sovereignty long before any laws are formally rewritten. To remain credible partners, they must align procurement doctrine and budgeting with external expectations rather than domestic priorities. This alignment often begins with equipment replacement, discarding affordable legacy systems for approved alternatives. The upgrade is framed as modernization even when it delivers marginal gains at dramatically higher cost. Financing these transitions usually requires borrowing because local economies cannot absorb the shock internally. Debt becomes leverage, narrowing policy choices and increasing reliance on external assistance. Once dependent on foreign supply chains, operational independence fades quietly. Spare parts software updates and training approvals become instruments of influence. Strategic autonomy shrinks as maintenance schedules dictate diplomatic behavior. Energy policy follows the same pattern, replacing cheap proximity with expensive reliability premiums. Households feel this shift immediately through higher utility bills and industrial layoffs. Governments justify the pain as resilience while the costs settle permanently into the economy. Over time, fiscal flexibility erodes, leaving fewer options during genuine domestic crises. Economic policy becomes reactive, shaped by obligations rather than opportunity. Sovereignty transforms from control into compliance, measured by adherence instead of choice. Smaller states adapt by prioritizing alliance satisfaction above long-term development. Citizens are told independence has a price but rarely shown the full invoice. The relationship begins to resemble patronage more than partnership. National strategy narrows until deviation feels dangerous, even when circumstances change. At this stage, sovereignty exists on paper, while finances quietly dictate reality. As debt compounds, the real danger shifts from invasion to insolvency. because financial stress can destabilize nations faster than any external threat. Modern security is funded on credit, meaning today's protection is paid for by tomorrow's taxpayers at interest. When interest rates rise, every defense commitment becomes more expensive without adding any new capability. Servicing this debt begins competing directly with pensions, healthcare, and public investment. In several countries, interest payments already exceed core social spending growth. Bond markets react quickly to perceived risk, demanding higher yields from heavily committed states. Higher borrowing costs ripple outward, raising expenses across the entire economy. Governments respond with austerity framed as responsibility, even though obligations remain untouched. Citizens feel squeezed from both sides, paying more while receiving less. This fiscal pressure increases political instability, the very outcome security spending claims to prevent. Debt limits flexibility, reducing the ability to respond to genuine emergencies. When crises overlap, financial fragility becomes a national security risk itself. Inflation compounds the problem, quietly taxing households through higher prices. Military demand outbids civilian sectors for the materials, labor, and energy. Everyday costs rise not because of scarcity, but because priorities shift. The checkout line becomes another place where security policy is paid. Over time, voters disengage, believing outcomes are predetermined by markets. Democracy weakens when budgets feel automatic and unchangeable. The greatest vulnerability is not lack of arms, but lack of fiscal resilience. At this point, security spending protects borders while hollowing out the society inside them. After destruction comes reconstruction, where the bill arrives long after the contracts were signed and the profits already collected. Rebuilding shattered regions is presented as humanitarian duty, yet the financing often mirrors the same debt-driven logic that funded the conflict. Taxpayers are asked to contribute again, this time for roads, power grids, and housing reduced to rubble. The sums involved are staggering, stretching across decades rather than budget cycles. Defense suppliers exit early, while reconstruction firms step in to claim the next phase of guaranteed revenue. Aid is rarely free because loans replace grants once attention fades. These loans demand collateral, turning public assets into bargaining chips. Land, energy infrastructure, and future revenue streams become tools for repayment. Nations survive on maps while ownership quietly changes hands. The economic aftermath reshapes societies more permanently than the fighting itself. Refugee flows strain the public services far from the battlefield. Political divisions deepen as costs spread unevenly across populations. The promise of a peace dividend never materializes, replaced instead by a permanent conflict surcharge. Security spending normalizes at higher levels, justified by lessons learned. What was once exceptional becomes standard operating procedure. At home, citizens inherit inflation debt and degraded public investment. The true casualty is opportunity measured in projects never funded and futures never pursued. When all costs are tallied, security appears less like protection and more like deferred payment. The system persists because the price is fragmented and delayed. In the end, the debt remains long after the rhetoric fades.